Everybody, it's Professor Snart checking in. I'm back in town after a quick trip out to Portland, Oregon last week for a conference. It was pretty fun. I didn't see much of the city, honestly. It was a pretty busy conference, but I barely made it out in front of the big storm that hit on Tuesday. Tons of people from the East Coast didn't even make it at all or were delayed by days, so I feel kind of lucky. Anyway, back into our course here, looking at where we're at and where we're headed. So due date wise, we've just finished up our, most recent workshop, the creative nonfiction, which I've talked about as a genre. It is distinct from purely creative fiction, just a short story, but clearly there's a lot of overlap there in terms of the techniques that you use to tell a story that's more or less true. So it's funny that in some ways it should be really easy because we're working from mostly our own experience, and yet it's maybe challenging for that very same reason, is that we have to really test ourselves as writers to make our stories interesting to other people, not by necessarily telling really dramatic or traumatic things, but by telling the story in a really effective way. So it's a funny genre in as much as it's very close to us and should be very easy, but is in fact very challenging because, you know, we have to do things that we can't do in purely fantastical made-up fiction. Okay, so I'm going to turn those around pretty quickly as far as grades go. Just a reminder that I offer limited feedback to each and every person. It's just too time-consuming, and I'd never be able to keep up with getting work back to you. But we have built into our course, right, some official kind of conference meeting times, and we have another one coming up in a few weeks. But you can always reach out to me by email to get further feedback, especially if you have targeted questions about a particular aspect of writing that you're interested in or not sure you're doing very well or would like some tips on. So again, limited feedback as I return grades basically, but always open to talking further with you, whether it's in person, synchronously, but virtual, or just via email. So keep that in mind so you're not just getting that number back and kind of left wondering. And remember, especially for workshops, the grade is less about the thing that you've written, because that becomes very subjective and again just kind of bogs us down in a lot of stuff that we're not super interested in as far as like who's right and who's wrong. But a lot of the grade is really just, did you post your file on time? Is it accessible? And then what investment did you make in the feedback part of it to your group members? And again, one of the reasons that I don't weigh in too heavily on each and every person's piece of work for each and every workshop is that I really do want your primary focus as a writer to be on the feedback you're getting from your group mates, right? From your peers, because those are your readers. And especially because you're getting feedback from a variety of people, I think you can weigh it more effectively in terms of things that you really do need to focus on, or things that were maybe just idiosyncratic to one particular reader. So if I start horning in on that, it kind of upsets the balance of the whole workshop. But again, I'm always open to further discussion, kind of individually, if you want to reach out to me. Okay, so we'll wrap that up, and then it moves us into our next genre, which is poetry. So we have a quick week here where we get just our feet wet a little bit. Spring break figures into our class just in terms of timing. And then poetry workshop we turn around with. We have a set of student conferences. I've labeled them end of the term, and it's not really the end of the term. We still have a couple of weeks after that, although we are getting kind of close, especially once you factor in the spring break. But there's sort of like a time for us where we have a much broader perspective of things to talk about, because you've done, at this point, a whole bunch of writing, as opposed to, say, early on, where, again, you're just kind of getting some ideas from the course about the techniques of writing. We haven't really covered a lot at that point, but of course by now, down here, we've done a variety of workshops, covered a variety of genres. So hopefully you might have questions that are now arising out of that much larger body of work. The question that I'll ask you, especially if you don't necessarily have a lot to talk about, which is okay, is really just like, what have you learned up to this point? And beyond that, what theoretical ideas about writing, or kind of abstract ideas about writing, have you now started to really actively think about and even apply in your work? Because the theory part's kind of the easy part. It's the application that's really the difficult part. Okay, so poetry, we get started with one of my favorite units, or at least one of my favorite clips here from the movie Contact. It's an excerpt that can be, it seems a little corny and hyper-dramatic when it's outside of the context of the movie. I think that sort of happens, right, with any example that you might pull from a dramatic work, but you'll clearly see why it's built into our poetry course here. A quick reading assignment, right, and then kind of the meat of the unit here. So before we do a lot of writing of our own poetry, we're going to look at least one pretty famous published poet, T.S. Eliot, both as a poet but also a theorizer of poetry. So he was a writer of poetry but also a critic or a theorist as well. So he had those two interesting perspectives as a practitioner but also write the theoretical part. So I'm going to have you read Tradition and the Individual Talent, an essay of his from a collection called The Sacred Wood. And it's kind of long, right? I won't bore you with it here. And a bit of a slog in some places, but I have asked you to focus on this part in particular, which is where he gives his theory of the poetic or the creative mind, which is one that I really ascribe to. It just sort of resonates with me, so it feels right in the way that he formulates it. But the whole essay is really bundled up in the title. Like, the title actually does a really good job here. It's a kind of a theorizing of the individual talent or the individual poet, the artist, relative to the larger poetic or artistic tradition. Like, how does a new work or new author fit into the longer tradition? What should we know or not know about the longer tradition to fit in? And again, Eliot had some very, very particular ideas about the role of the poet relative to tradition. And although he was a modernist and in many ways broke from tradition, he was still deeply believed that new poets needed a working knowledge of the poetic tradition. And so this sort of goes back to some advice I'd given earlier, that if there's two for sures that I can give you about creative writing, the first is that if you write for publication and send your work out, it will get rejected, which is kind of a negative thing to say, but I really offer it as just a realistic positive in some ways. So if your work comes back rejected, you don't just give up the whole enterprise because you'll never get never get accepted. It just is a fact of life. And you've probably heard stories about famous authors like J.K. Rowling, for example, whose manuscript gets rejected 30 times or whatever it was until that one magical time, and now, right, she burns money to stay warm or whatever. So that's the one truism. The useful one here for us is that all good writers are also good, or at least avid readers, which is something that a lot of people think, oh, if I want to be my own writer, I shouldn't read other stuff because then I'll get lost in that other stuff and my voice will start sounding like that. And it's not really true. It's just a way of getting out of reading. So someone like Eliot was a very traditional kind of reader in many ways. He was really, really a polymath, you might say. He read all kinds of stuff across all kinds of, academic and non-academic disciplines. He just sort of took it all in. And you'll see how that fits in, maybe even leads him to this theory of the poetic mind as a kind of gathering place for various fragments. Okay, so his idea was that the individual should not really ignore tradition, but had to be really cognizant of it. The modernist agenda, though, was to take that tradition and kind of repackage it, not just to retell the same story over and over and over again in the same forms and in the same voice and with the same techniques, but to repurpose tradition in a really intentional and aggressive kind of way. We may not see that, or you may not notice it so much in a work which we read later here. I'll come back to this in a sec. The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, probably one of Eliot's most famous or most taught, most read poems. But his other, maybe more famous but least read poem, The Wasteland, is really where you see that the theory that's espoused in Tradition and the Individual Talent being practiced. So read through Tradition and Individual Talent, focus especially here, and then take a look at this very short commercial that HP produced a number of years ago, featuring Gwen Stefani from No Doubt and from her own work, where she espouses a theory of creativity, or at least the script has her espouse a theory of creativity that is amazingly like Eliot's. I was really shocked, and thank goodness for YouTube that now collects all this stuff for us so we can see them kind of next to each other here. I'm going to ask you to read Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock as it was originally published here in our own poetry magazine back in the early 20th century. And it's interesting to read it in this format because you'll notice one obvious thing that's missing that we usually get in textbooks and the usual stuff is the absence of footnotes. And so when we think about the individual's relationship to tradition and reuse and repurposing of tradition, not rejecting it, how that shows up, for example, in the very first piece of the love song, which is a quote from Dante's Inferno, or the Divine Comedy generally. So my Italian is it's a little rusty, right? So if I didn't have a footnote, I would have no idea what this says or means, or its relationship to the poem. And of course it means something, and of course it bears a really important relationship to the poem. But one of the challenges that Eliot presents, unless we have the editorial, framework of footnotes and all that stuff, is exactly how we as readers are supposed to engage with poetry. And so this was an era of poets being kind of intentionally challenging, both elusive, like the meaning is hard to get, but allusive, so lots of references to things like texts, authors, historical events, philosophical systems, religious ideas outside of the specific poem that the reader was just expected to work for. And so, it begs all of these questions about, is that really, is it realistic? Oh my God. For us to have to deal with all that? Oh my God. Okay, I guess that's the signal to wrap it up. Just wait. Shut that down. Okay, go away. Okay, so here's the discussion board. If I wasn't 12 minutes in, I might just start all over, but no way. All right, so there's a bunch of questions here that ask you really to just consider the pieces that I've assembled here. The love song itself, the HP/Gwen Stefani commercial, and then some of the ideas that are showing up in tradition and the individual talent, Eliot's essay. And I'll leave you with this. I sometimes wonder, is it just pure coincidence here that connects the idea espoused in the commercial with Eliot's train of thought? Or, and I think this is legitimate, is there enough people that kind of start in English that then go into advertising, if not the arts generally, where there's a more kind of direct lineage? Not that someone sits at the table and thinks, oh, we should make an HP commercial that uses the ideas from tradition and the individual talent. But at some point in someone's academic career, they run into this specific thing, but certainly the idea that's put forward here, and that becomes a way of thinking about creativity that does in fact find its way into the more public sphere like we have in this commercial. So coincidence? I don't really think so. Direct lineage? Well, maybe not, but probably somewhere in the middle of those two. Okay, so we have this week here before spring break, just to shift gears pretty quickly. So keep on top of the due dates as we get out of creative nonfiction into poetry. Notice that coming out of spring break, which again doesn't exactly affect us the way it would for a face-to-face course, we have our next workshop right away. So our poetry workshop coming up with our posting date and then our turnaround date. You'll notice that the groups are a little bigger for poetry, just because the poems that people submit tend to be relatively shorter than the longer creative nonfiction or fiction workshops. We then have a little time carved out for meeting individually again, a nice way to just sort of check in, honestly. We turn right around to a final workshop, which is open genre, which means you can write anything, maybe something we've covered, something we haven't done before that you're interested in. And then we have a final reflection that's just off the screen down here. And that kind of wraps up our course. So it probably doesn't feel like we're really close to being done. At least it doesn't for me. But especially once we factor in where we're at now, spring break, a couple of workshops, our conference time, we are getting, towards the end. It's really only midterm or a little past right now. But I think with spring break and the multiple workshops we have after, it just feels like we're a little closer to the end. Okay, so I've gone on a bit longer than I meant to, but I wanted to really catch us up. It feels like it's been a while since I checked in, so we have a handle on what we've just finished, the stuff that's immediately in front of us, and then kind of that bigger picture looking forward. You can always jump in here at the student conferences and grab a sign up for a time, or if none of those times work, you can always be in touch with me and we'll figure something out.